Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Principal Investigator Research Series. We will be recording this session for those who wish to refer to it later. If anyone has topic ideas for future presentations, please send us an email at orsp. I lost my audio there for a second. Sorry about that. We're currently planning for spring 2023, and we would really appreciate your input on topics pertinent to you as investigators. So again, if you have any topic ideas for us, please email or contact us. Today, we'll be hearing from Anna Simonson. Dr. Simonson is the librarian liaison to the medical school and the health and natural sciences. She received her PhD from the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and her master's in library and information science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She completed her postdoc with Danielle Kenyon's lab at Sanford Research with the Population Health Group. Her research interests include information access, health, humanities, digital scholarship, and the history of medicine. She is the head of a new library initiative named Digital Scholarship and Research Services that aims to support the research of the faculty, staff, and students at USD. Dr. Simonson has prepared a 40-minute presentation for you all today and will welcome discussion and questions toward the end. At this time, I will turn things over to her.
Thank you, Gina. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. So good afternoon, and thank you all for joining today to discuss this new NIH data management and sharing policy, which goes into effect on January 25th, 2023. So as you just heard, my name is Anna Simonson. I'm a liaison librarian to the health and natural sciences here at USD. And this webinar is the product of a new library initiative, Digital Scholarship and Research Services, and also a collaboration with the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, PI Research Development Program. In short, we're here to discuss this new policy that requires anyone applying for funds on or after January 25th to include as a part of their application a data management and sharing plan. So how you'll manage your data and your plan for sharing that data. So the NIH has produced over 3 hours of video on this new policy and several more hours worth of reading. So one of my main goals was to boil all of that down into roughly 40 minutes in order to highlight for you the most important things about this new policy and hopefully save you the time that you might have spent looking for it. Nevertheless, I'm going to be throwing a lot of information at you. So if you need further clarification on anything after this is finished, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information will be on the final slide. So today's webinar can be broken down into 4 parts. First, we're going to discuss the results of a survey that I sent out to various faculty in the health and natural sciences a couple of weeks ago to kind of take the temperature, so to speak, of the culture of research at USD as it relates to data management and sharing. So through this survey, I also wanted to uncover comments and concerns that people might have about the new data management and sharing policy in order to make this webinar more useful and relevant to this particular community. So in researching what this new policy entails, I paid close attention to what people noted as concerns in the survey. Second, we'll discuss the scope, goals, and requirements of the new NIH policy. And third, we'll break down what writing a DMS plan actually entails, how long it is, what elements it includes, those kinds of things, so that when it comes time for you to write one in January, it's not completely unfamiliar for you. Lastly, we'll end with a short Q&A, and if you don't get a chance to ask a question during the webinar today, or if you think of something later, please reach out to me. Also, I want to note that the director of the Wagner Health Sciences Library, Shelley Bassick, will be monitoring the chat today, so please feel free to make comments and ask questions there throughout the webinar, and we'll respond to these comments during the Q&A. And if there are a lot and we don't get through all of them, we will send a follow-up email that contains answers to those questions. Relatedly, if we can't answer one of your questions that does get asked today, I will do some digging and follow up with you. I also want to point out that the Human Subjects Director for USD's IRB is also with us today, Mark Guilford, and he is going to be a great person for you to direct questions to as well. Hi, Mark. So he's familiar with this policy and will be able to help you determine if your data is de-identified and ready to be shared. A common theme that I've noticed in the different webinars that I've attended regarding this policy is the importance of collaboration between departments and offices in order to successfully implement this change. So Mark's contact information along with Melinda Robinson's is also on the final slide. So because this webinar is about a new NIH data management and sharing policy, I want to quickly point out how the NIH defines these two things. So they define data management as the process of validating, organizing, protecting, maintaining, and processing scientific data to ensure the accessibility, reliability, and quality of the scientific data for its users. Data sharing they define as the act of making data, of scientific data, available for use by others, like the larger research community, institutions, the broader public, for example, via an established repository. So let's start by looking at the results of the survey that I sent out. So in the survey, I asked 4 questions. The first one was, is data sharing important to you? Why or why not? The second one was, what does good data stewardship mean to you? Third, what concerns, if any, do you have about data management and sharing? And fourth, what concerns, if any, do you have about the new NIH DMS policy? The responses were anonymous and I also de-identified them. So let's look at that first one, thoughts on data sharing. So I received several replies and here were some of them. Data sharing, it is important for open science. It's important in terms of ensuring reproducibility of experiments and their findings. It has not been important to me in the past. It is important to disseminate data in a timely manner for public good. It's important to build support for research and engagement with communities we do research with. And I believe it's important as long as it is possible within the context of the particular project. It is important as a level of peer review and also extending knowledge. The second question about good data stewardship and its meaning. Here were some of the responses I got. Being able to have the data ready at hand for your own purposes and for others to be able to look at. Storage, dissemination, and protection. At this time, it only means following the rules stipulated in the applicable IRB. It is crucial for further data analysis and also helpful for others to explore your data or to reproduce the findings. Saving data in such a way that it can be mined at a later date, realizing that the technology that exists now may differ later. Learning best practices to ensure data security as well as longevity. It means to remember that human subjects derived data came from people and that their data must be protected. Data gets to the people who need it most. That data is not just hoarded by PIs with great resources and many grants. The third question about data management and sharing in general. The time investment was something of concern to people. The time investment involved on fulfilling this obligation, time commitment, data are useless unless they are clean and a system is followed. This will mean that extra steps of work will be required. Data sharing policies need to recognize the complexity of working with marginalized populations or those that are sharing traumatic experiences and whether they are willing to share their data. IRB privacy, protection of IP, and if there is personnel time built in to adequately do this well. And lastly, concerns specifically about the new NIH DMS policy, that it will become way more burdensome to publish data in general, not just data that are gathered with NIH support. Everyone follows the NIH's lead. The time investment required, 2 people didn't have concerns, 1 didn't know enough about it. Red tape, coordinating IRB DUA. Also persistence of the data. How will IT and others ensure that data will be retained on the servers for 15 years? Or if requirements will honor sovereign nations' laws. So as you can see, people have a lot of thoughts, ideas, and concerns about data management and sharing, and I try to respond to most of these specifically in this webinar. I also want to point out that this is a subject, data sharing, that is increasingly being talked about in the broader scientific community and in the context of COVID-19. And the NIH is certainly responding to some of this with this new policy. So for instance, Nature published an article in June of this year that highlighted a lack of data sharing in general and noted the numerous reasons why things weren't being shared, including some of the things that came up in the survey, especially concerns about privacy and a lack of consent. So in this particular study, researchers looked at about 3,500 biomedical and health science articles published in 1 month by 282 different BMC journals. And the team identified 381 articles with links to data stored in online repositories and another 1,792 papers for which the authors indicated in statements that their data sets would be available on reasonable request. So the remaining studies stated that their data were in the published manuscript and its supplements or generated no data, so sharing didn't apply. But ultimately, only approximately 7% of authors actually shared their data. And so data sharing is an increasing concern, especially for organizations like the NIH, which is the largest public funder of biomedical research in the world. So let's move on to the scope, goals, and requirements of the new policy. As I mentioned earlier, this new policy goes into effect on January 25th, 2023. If the due date for the grant you're applying for falls on or after this date, you must include a data management and sharing plan as a part of your grant application. So just for clarification, submitting early does not exempt you from including this plan. The only exception right now is non-competing awards, which are not immediately subject to the policy. So the NIH has described this policy adoption as an iterative process that began in 2016 with a request for information. And this slide is modeled after one that the NIH created to depict their process. So the first draft of the policy went out in 2019, at which time the NIH held a public webinar and released a request for comments. So the final policy took into consideration all of the comments that they received about the draft and was officially released in 2020. A record of these drafts and all the comments with the NIH's comments on the comments can be found on the NIH website. The NIH has also emphasized that this new policy is not really the start of something new at all, as the NIH has long championed open science. So the 2003 data sharing policy currently in effect requires researchers to include a data sharing plan in research proposals seeking $500,000 or more in direct costs. The 2015 genomic data sharing policy created the expectation that researchers share large-scale genomic data. And in 2016, the NIH published the FAIR standards, that biomedical research data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So these are not the only policies and standards related to data sharing at the NIH, but they are three of the more prominent ones that I wanted to highlight as a part of the new policy development and requirements. So we've touched on why the NIH is implementing this policy, but I want to point out just a few more details. In short, the NIH wants to promote scientific discovery and advances by making data sharing the rule rather than the exception. So according to the NIH, the goal is to increase the sharing of scientific data generated from NIH-funded research to ultimately enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. So this new policy is meant to encourage scientific discovery by making it easier for researchers to test the validity of research findings, to strengthen analysis through combined data sets, and also to foster trust in publicly funded research. In sum, this new policy is going to replace the 2003 data sharing policy. So the new policy applies to all research funded or conducted by the NIH that results in the generation of scientific data. The award amount no longer matters. The new policy will also combine with the genomic data sharing policy of 2015 where applicable. So after January 25th, the NIH will no longer be collecting separate GDS plans. So genomic data sharing considerations such as where and when genomic data will be shared will be expected to be addressed in data management and sharing plans. So this brings us to the scope of the new policy. How do you know if this policy actually applies to you? So as previously noted, the new DMS policy removes the financial component and applies to all researchers using NIH funds to generate scientific data. So the definition of scientific data is particularly important, and the NIH actually asked for feedback about the draft version of their definition. So after getting feedback from stakeholders, the NIH came up with the following definition of scientific data: the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings, regardless of whether the data are used to support scholarly publications. So I want to point out a few things here. First, the idea of sufficient quality was added after receiving feedback as a way to avoid making the DMS plan simply perfunctory. So they don't want you to simply dump everything into repositories, flooding these repositories with both useful and useless information. So the data the NIH wants shared should be useful or interpretable data. Second, the words validate and replicate here are not meant to dictate how the data should be used when shared. So it's simply meant to be a way for you to determine if you are generating scientific data. And last, the statement about publications is meant to address data that might be attached to null or negative findings. So data attached to null or negative findings should still be shared. And the NIH felt that this statement covered that issue without further elaboration. As such, the NIH has clarified that what things do not apply to the new policy, and they have listed these things out. So they fall outside of the scope of the NIH definition of scientific research. You do not need to share any of these things: your lab notebooks, plans for future research, and this list you can also find on the NIH website. Relatedly, not all activities fall under this new NIH DMS policy. So the policy does apply to research projects, some career development awards, small business awards, and research centers, but there are many things, as you can see, that fall outside of the policy scope, which are noted below. So make sure that you check and see which things fall under the scope of the new policy before you write one. And there are a lot of nuances to all of the grants. So when you really break it down, the new policy requires two things. It requires that you submit a data management and sharing plan with your grant application, and it requires that you comply with your plan. So the NIH has actually pointed out that it does not require that you share your data, even though this is called a data sharing plan. So what I mean by that is that according to the NIH, the policy does not require that all data be shared. It does, however, hold the expectation that researchers maximize the appropriate sharing of scientific data. So if you're planning to not share your data, you need to have a justifiable reason why. And so just to be clear, if you're planning not to share your data, you still have to submit a DMS plan with your grant application that details why you will not be sharing your data. As you can see here on this slide, there are actually many justifiable reasons for limiting the sharing of data. I will not read all of these here, but I do want to point out a few things as they relate to the survey discussed at the beginning of the webinar. Privacy and safety of research participants is of great concern to the NIH. And when either of these would be compromised, you can justify not sharing your data in your DMS plan. So the DMS policy is also not meant to override any federal, state, local, or tribal laws, regulations, or policies. So if any of these prohibits disclosure, you can include this in your DMS plan with the expectation that this data will not be shared. So as noted at the bottom here, the NIH respects and recognizes tribal sovereignty and American Indian and Alaska Native communities' data sharing concerns, and the NIH has proposed additional considerations when working with tribes and AIAN communities. So this information can be found under the supplemental documents attached to the new DMS policy on the NIH website. They have numerous supplemental documents that detail these kinds of specifics. So I also want to point out that the final DMS policy clarifies agency respect for tribal sovereignty in the absence of written tribal laws or policies. So if it is determined that you should share your data, the NIH has highlighted 3 best practices for protecting privacy when sharing human research participant data. First, de-identify to the greatest extent while maintaining utility. So you can use the common rule and HIPAA privacy rule standards here. Second, to establish agreements for transferring your data. The NIH recommends the use of scientific data sharing and/or use agreements, preferably standardized when sharing data from participants with and from repositories. So these agreements should be considered even if scientific data are de-identified. And third, understand the applicable legal protections and limitations on disclosure. So here you would want to look at, for instance, the NIH certificates of confidentiality policy. So when and where does the NIH expect you to share your data? There are 2 possibilities with the new policy as to when, either at the time of an associated publication or by the end of the performance period, whichever one comes first. For where, the NIH recommends what they call an established repository, which they have defined using several different markers for consideration. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but I do want to point out 3 that relate more directly to your survey comments. So the NIH recommends repositories that have, first of all, long-term sustainability. So this means that the repository has a plan in place for long-term management of data, including maintaining integrity, authenticity, and availability of data sets. Another thing would be building on a stable technical infrastructure and having contingency plans to ensure data are available and maintained during and after unforeseen events. Second is the aspect related to security and integrity. So the NIH would suggest a repository that has documented measures in place to meet these generally accepted criteria for preventing unauthorized access to modification of or release of data with levels of security that are appropriate to the sensitivity of data. And third, confidentiality there. The NIH would look for a repository that has documented capabilities for ensuring that administrative, technical, and physical safeguards are employed to comply with applicable confidentiality. So as you can see, choosing the right repository is actually going to address several of the issues that you brought up in the survey, particularly those related to privacy and security. And this is something the NIH is asking you to think about prior to submitting your grant, as repository details, we'll see in the next section, are a part of the DMS plan. So this slide might be reassuring for some of you. Several people expressed concern over the costs that might be incurred to produce and comply with the DMS plan. And I want to point out that the NIH has built space into the budget section of grant applications so that researchers can request funds for data management and sharing. So more information about how to request these funds for data management and sharing can be found on the website. So let's move on to part 3, the basics of the DMS plan. So what does this plan actually look like? So here is a general overview of the process. As I just noted, you'll submit your DMS plan and budget request as part of the funding application or proposal. According to the NIH, peer review will not review your DMS plans. Hence, it will not factor into your overall score, but they will consider the budget items. So I want to note here, however, that if data sharing is integral to the project and tied to a scored review criterion in the funding opportunity announcement, program staff will assess the adequacy of the DMS plan per standard procedure. But peer reviewers will also be able to view the DMS plan attachment and may factor that information into scores as outlined in the evaluation criteria. So plans must be approved by the funding institute prior to the award. So as you can see, there will be some nuance depending on the award that you are applying for. So you'll want to pay attention to those details in writing your plan. So what does it actually look like? This is a snapshot of a draft from the NIH website. And you can actually use this model for your grant applications and simply add to and delete from the document that they have on there. The main thing to remember are, first, the DMS plan is not supposed to exceed 2 pages in length. When the NIH requested feedback on the first draft of the policy, many people actually indicated that this was too short, but the NIH has held firm on this one, and it maintained that it must remain 2 pages or less. So for those of you concerned about the time that will go into writing these plans, you can at least be assured that they are not lengthy. However, this means that they must be very well thought out and concise. The plans need to also model the FAIR principles. You need to describe your plans, including how your data will be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And lastly, the plan must include 6 different elements, and you can see the first 2 here on this screen. Here are the 6 elements listed out. It's important when you're making your plans that you address each one specifically and clearly in your DMS plan. There are instructions for each element on the NIH website. And in the next few slides, I've included a few examples of what you might actually write in some of these sections. So let's quickly look at these elements one by one. So the first element is data type. The NIH wants to know in general what types of data you will be generating, as well as the amount of data you will be generating. Not all data that is generated during research needs to be preserved. So the NIH expects you to consider the ethical, legal, and technical factors when determining what to keep and what not to keep. Additionally, you need to include metadata and other associated data in this element. For instance, data collection instruments and protocols would belong here. The point here is that the information is specific, yet it can be brief, a couple of paragraphs. For those of you whose research falls under the GDS policy, you should note here that the GDS policy expects certain types of data to be shared that may not be covered by the DMS policy's definition of scientific data. So you need to adhere to the GDS policy and include all required data types regardless of the DMS policy definition. If in doubt, the NIH encourages you to reach out to them for clarification on this when these 2 plans mesh together. The second element in the plan is the related tools, software, and/or code that you'll be using for your research. So in this section, you need to detail whether or not any specialized tools are needed to access or manipulate your shared data. So if so, you'll need to detail the names of the needed tools, software, and how they can be accessed. For instance, do you need to download something in order to open the data? This will help you think through the software that you're using for your research and how easy it might be for other people to get and use. So things like, is the software free like R, or will people have to pay money to buy tools in order to access your data on their computers? So this is something you'll need to consider when forming your plans and thinking through your research methods. The third element relates to standards. So data standards are an important part of the new DMS plan for the NIH, as standards provide the consistency and technical specifications for data sharing. Similar to element 2, you can think of this as asking, how will others be able to read and interpret my data? What common data standards will be applied? Data dictionaries, data identifiers, definitions, and things like that. So element 4 is data preservation, access, and associated timelines. Is there a repository where your data will be archived? This is where you would name that. How will the data be findable? Does it have a persistent unique identifier? When and how long will the data be made available? remember that when, according to this new policy, has a definition, right? As soon as the research is published or the performance period comes to an end, whichever one comes first. It's also important to note here that some grants have suggestions for repositories. So if a grant suggests that you deposit your information in a specific place, it's advised by the NIH that you do this. If they do not suggest a repository, the NIH suggests finding a data type or subject specific repository. Finding a repository, they're putting more and more information on their website about these kinds of things that play a large part in this new policy. So finding a repository for you to share your data has information, and they're adding to that information to help you be able to find one. So element 5 is an opportunity for you to expand on your issues of access. So are there any factors that might create limitations to access and distribution? For instance, informed consent might place limitations on the sharing of your data, and this needs to be stated in element 5. Perhaps state, local, or tribal laws come into play here, placing restrictions on the sharing of your data. Other things to consider in this element would be like, if your research pertains to human subjects, how will you protect the privacy, rights, and confidentiality of those participants? Are there any other things that might limit the extent of you sharing your data? And the last element, element 6, relates to the oversight of data management. So the NIH wants you to indicate here how compliance with the DMS plan will be monitored over time. And I've included here an example of that kind of information. Who is going to oversee your plan? Who has access to your metadata, and perhaps why? And that is it. So the 2 pages of your DMS plan include these 6 elements. These are the 6 elements of the new plan. Each one is probably not going to be more than a couple of paragraphs, but again, it's going to require a lot of thought because it has to be very, very concise. So just to recap, this new policy goes into effect soon, January 25th, 2023. It requires that all researchers applying for funds, with very few exceptions, include a data management and sharing plan as a part of their application. The plan asks you to consider these 6 elements, including choosing a repository where your data will be shared, which is required either by the time of an associated publication or the end of the award. The NIH is implementing this new plan to encourage data sharing in open science, and there are, of course, nuances to each grant application. So the NIH does encourage researchers applying for funding to start on these plans early, especially the first time around. So there are numerous resources available on the NIH website to help you with this process. And there are also several people in offices at USD where you can turn for help. And on the next slide, I have our contact information. So you can see my contact information at the top there. I've added Mark Guilford's information and also Melinda Robinson's. We are here to help you and make this an easy adjustment. And if you need help putting your plan together or choosing a repository, you can reach out to any one of us. That is all I have for you, the boiled down version of the NIH data management and sharing policy. So I am going to open it up to discussion, comments, and questions. And that is it. Did we have anything in the chat? I'm not sure here.
Nothing in the chat right at the moment.
Okay.
Feel free to start typing or unmute yourself and ask questions.
I don't think we can hear you, Dr. Rezvani.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, all right. It's the first time they said that the host is not allowing on mute. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
So my questions that for one of the element that is sharing, having a kind of a center to be able to upload these and then to be shared. So I usually put all of my data in the R drive that just USD has access. What if I wanted to say that, okay, it would be in that file or this, is it something that USD will provide that one? Instead of, because nobody can access from the outside of USD to the R drive.
Mhm.
So what should I put that in that sharing element? If I wanted to put some of the data to be seen by people that they want to look at the data, the raw data.
Well, if I don't want to speak for the NIH here, but from everything that I've read, I think the NIH would probably encourage in your plan that you look for an additional repository that is more open access, that people would be able to get to without permission or having to go through somebody, based on some of the questions that have been asked to them about picking a repository. That seems to be their kind of go-to response. So it would be okay to put it in the institutional one and to note that in the DMS plan and say, you know, this will require permissions.
Okay.
But I think they would encourage you to also choose one that would be more available.
And this available one is through NIH. So NIH has got this kind of.
Yes, so the NIH actually has a fairly robust repository section on their website. And they have kind of a tool for you to choose a repository that might work for your data. And they're building that up constantly because a lot of researchers have asked these kinds of questions. So on their website, they do have a lot of repositories listed, choices for you to deposit your data. And of course, those are all established repositories, so you wouldn't have to go through that list and kind of and make sure that they follow those kinds of rules for privacy and confidentiality and things like that. So they've kind of vetted those things for you.
Okay.
So I would encourage you to look at the website and see what they have there.
Okay. Thank you.
Dr. XJ Wang, he has his hand raised. If
Yes, yes. Thank you for the timely seminar. So in terms of the timing of sharing, I think one either public, I can say if the publish is shared, that's okay. That's the one says by end of a performance period. Say if a 5 year or 4 years R1 grant, by end of 4 years, usually you have quite a bit of paper data that not be able to publish it by that time. So is any grace period you can deposit but not open to be shared, or?
Again, I don't want to speak for the NIH, but from what I have read and heard from them, they're pretty firm on anything that falls under scientific data that is not one of those eliminated categories that they have listed, that all be shared within one of the two, either at the associated publication or the end of the award. You know, again, there are a lot of exceptions, and if you think that timing isn't going to work for you, I would look at where you might include that in the DMS plan. You can always adjust the plan during the award This is one thing I didn't mention. And in fact, if your plans change, they do want you to update that and contact them. So I would recommend probably finding a place in the award. If you anticipate that timeline will be difficult because of your particular research, I think there would be space for you to indicate that in the DMS plan.
So in other words, the end of the period, by the
Mhm.
end of the project period
Yeah,
to be shared it depends on how you say in your DMS plan.
right.
Okay.
So yes, when the funding ends, or when your award period ends, or when you publish, they want your data available.
Yeah, I attended one of the workshop seminar too. I saw people raise that question, but at least at the time I was there, they didn't address that. It's
Right.
not gonna be after for 90%, I will guess 90% of grant is gonna like that. By end of the period, you're gonna have a portion of data not published.
Mhm.
So the NIH must have some general guideline or any supplemental guideline to address that. This is not just applied to a few people. This is gonna be
Right.
the vast majority.
Yeah.
And a lot of cases, people don't want to, I don't think it's, well, if NIH says you are public funded, it doesn't matter published or not, you have to be shared, then that's a little bit different, quite different from what's the policy so far.
Right. It is quite different.
And okay, so in turn, back to the previous question, Cosmo mentioned about repository. I guess my questions, this related to office research probably or library. Will USD will establish any sort of repository for our funded research?
So the institutional repository for USD is RED, RED, and I think it would allow most data to be uploaded into that. Shelley might be able to speak more to this than me. She's a little bit more familiar with RED, but I would think that most things would be allowable in RED, right?
Yes, I think it takes almost any data type that I have seen so far. And then we also have the ability to, again, put that behind some sort of protection as well, if it's not quite ready to be all out or if permission would be required. So that is one instance where there's really not a storage limit, and I have not heard of a data type that we could not put in there. If you're thinking more in terms of a data repository that also requires some sort of like high-powered computing, we'd probably have that in place, but that would definitely be an IT question. I know they've built up quite a bit of storage as it relates to, for example, BRIN projects and things like that.
Yeah, if I may have one more question related to that in terms of the amount of data. This is related, I don't know, probably more too specific for you guys. For example, we have imaging data, say echocardiography. Those images by itself can be very large files. And then we derive numbers, data out of it. So here's where we cut the line. I mean, it's not, we have to save all the original images of, echocardiography data to be deposited and shared, or just that we're make data derived, the numbers derived out of it.
I think that would probably, my first thought on that is that would probably relate to budgeting that into your plan. So if it is that large amount of data that you might end up needing to pay for storage, for extra storage somewhere, I would consider budgeting, putting a line item in the application for that, those kinds of things. I know that the computing group at USD. Yes, Mark is shaking his head. Maybe Mark can speak more to this.
I don't think we have Ryan Johnson on here, but yes, the IT, the research computing group has some storage options. They are not free, but we can help facilitate that. And if you need more information about that, reach out to Melinda or myself. We can put you in touch with the right people in my office.
Okay, so storage is one thing. The other thing sound like you need to be able to accessible by others.
Yes, and I think Ryan also facilitates that as well.
Okay, thank you. Just a comment. Looks like I was thinking myself. Fortunately, I don't need to put a grant probably early part next year. So I was waiting to see if I can get to the state section next round. I'm gonna look at how the others do it. So I mean, as office of research or somebody with different schools, and they may want to have a group or personnel really work on to collect more those specific questions. And this is helpful. You have this general overview of this policy sense, but from us, I'm still quite uncertain how I'm going to write that plan. You understand? And without saying, of course, you have some maybe their example plans showed up in NIH website. I have not explored that. That's just a suggestion. I think. Good sense they're not gonna, the reviewer not gonna score on that, not gonna even look at it. Just it will be just the program officer or somebody else to read on that.
And that is a good suggestion. That's definitely something that we can look at putting together a workshop on creating the DMS plan. That would be an excellent thing to put together for this community. So I will talk with some people about doing that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Anna, I have a couple follow-up questions to some of the points that XJ brought out and that Shelley and Mark brought up. So this RED repository and the computing, the research computing center, are these the same thing? Is research computing maintaining RED?
No, so the research computing group, Ryan Johnson is in charge of that, and that is a separate group that that does large scale computing and working with data, but they charge a fee. You can pay them to maintain your data. RED is an institutional repository maintained by the library that, I don't know how large of a data set, right now there are no caps on it that I am aware of, but I'm not sure again how large of a data set has been, introduced into RED. So I suppose with this new policy, if there's,
So do either of these repositories have the mechanisms for, including the other elements? Because as XJ said, you could be putting in the raw data of a recording or a bunch of images, but it doesn't mean anything to anybody that accesses it unless they know what the conditions were of each experiment, basically.
Right.
And so, and that's what I assume that they mean by the meta-analysis that goes with it, or the metadata that goes with it. So do either of these resources have that capacity, basically?
I think we'd have to dig into that a little bit more. I might need a specific example to actually ask. So our institutional repository is hosted on a platform called bpress. And so that might be a question I would have to reach out to them for. And they are really good at providing examples from other institutions. So
okay. Because I mean, are you guys putting in data in the sense of spreadsheets and words? Is that what Red is usually doing? Because what XJ and what I and a number of other of us are going to be talking about is really high density data. Well, and in fact, we're not even as high density as like what Lee Bars or Arun Singh would be generating, data that is, you know, primary, you know, electrophysiology or echocardiogram measurements, basically.
Mhm.
Yeah, so right now, to my knowledge, it can take imaging, recording.
Okay.
What our folks are primarily using it for right now is an additional finding point to published articles, whether they're
Nice.
open access just yet or not, but then
Nice.
any data sets that are related to those as well.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I think maybe a good way to do this is to start keeping track of other people's data plans as the first round of these start coming in, and you know, some of us here in BBS and other research-based departments could give you examples. You know, I think you guys have a good idea of what, you know, human subjects kind of data are, because that has had a high reporting load to start with, but the kind of animal research stuff that some of the rest of us do, I think is going to be a different beast. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to suck out all the capacity and at least the research computer group right away, basically.
Okay, yeah, I'll reach out to Ryan and ask him some more questions about this, and we will get back to you on that for sure.
Do you have a sense of like how much this has to be in terms of, sometimes you do an experiment and it doesn't work, and that data may live on your computer for a little bit until you have the time to clean things up, but are you having to throw in, you know, when you talk about negative data, are you also talking about failed experiments? You know, every single Western gel that we've ever done, every single confocal stack, basically. I mean, these are the kinds of things that I think a lot of us are starting to worry about a bit.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of scientists at other universities are also bringing these points up.
Right.
So as far as I know right now, the NIH has indicated that, you know, all scientific data that can be classified as scientific data, regardless of whether it's attached to null findings, needs to be shared. So it doesn't
Right.
matter if it results in a publication. It's just if you generated it and it is scientific data, they expect that to be shared. So that's kind of their take on things at the moment. Now, when this actually goes into place and all of the issues start coming up that are going to inevitably, you know, happen when it is implemented, they might come out with some more specifics and put some more supplemental information out there about that. That is my guess as to what they're going to do.
And you may not have an answer on this, but just another question about what constitutes the end of the study period. So in some senses, that could be every year, because each year is a new cycle, basically, or, you know, we get a new funding announcement. They can cut the budget, for example. So is a new funding year the end of the period? Is the end of a 4 or 5 year grant the end of the period? Or if somebody competitively renews a grant, then does that push the end of the reporting period to the next 4 or 5 years down the line? Has that question ever come up in your research, Anna?
It has. And one of the things that the NIH has noted is that with those sorts of kind of specifics, that you should always reach out to the NIH ICO where your funding is, and check with them about the specifics if you're doing like a continuation or renewal of any sort. But so yes, I would reach out to the NIH specifically about that, because that might be very specific to whichever funding announcement you're responding to.
What does an ICO refer to? Information?
That's what, institute, I'm terrible with acronyms. I know how to use them, but institute something funding organization.
Okay.
So basically your program officer.
Oh, okay. Program officer. Okay. That's why I wondered, since it was something different than a,
But no, what I mean by that is that the specific institute that you're getting your grant from at the NIH, you know, the program officer that they've assigned to you, that I would,
okay.
they would know the specifics on those sorts of details.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I have basically two questions, and would it be possible? So I plan to submit one in the January cycle, so basically falls with the new policy. But would it be possible for some of you or of you to help sort of put a more like a draft for a generic draft for each of these big research directions at the USD, like for example, like, you know, us at the BBS probably have a kind of like similar, you know, more or less similar types of data sets, or, you know, a metadata or you know, image data that down the road that you know, the data management plan might look somewhat alike. And would that be would it be possible for you know, to create a sort of a slightly more detailed platform for each research direction, so we can kind of like fit in to save some time?
I think so. I think we could definitely look into doing that.
Okay. Right. That would be great. And when I finish my data management plan, can I share with you like
Absolutely.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah, that would be great. And another question is that is NIH plan to give us an example of how they want people to share data by, you know, have what some of their labs creating something that be models?
You know, they probably will. I haven't come across it yet, but they do have, you know, the example data management plan, like the kind of rubric for you.
Yeah.
With some examples to fill in that are pretty generic, but I don't think they yet have like a robust example for you to draw from their research. But I would imagine that question is going to be asked again, and that it will be. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, because from all the questions that everybody asks is like,
Yeah.
what type of data we need to deposit or something? Why doesn't the NIH provide just a couple of their labs,
Right.
and let people see like how they want people to do it by
Right.
doing it themselves first?
Right,
Yeah.
for sure.
Right.
And they are trying to do more of that, like with informed consent. They're trying to put together more documents that have language of consent that people can draw from and things like that. So they're trying to create more supplemental information that will be helpful for people, that people can model their work on. So I'm assuming that they will add to that
Okay.
on their
Thank you.
website as well.
Okay, no additional questions in the chat right now. Mark did share a link to some FAQs on the new policy. And we can certainly send that out with our email and slides as well.
Can you guys, okay, good. You can hear me now. I was going to say, if there are specific questions, I mean, this is new for all of us, but sponsor programs can definitely help guide, you know, if you have questions or exceptions to the rule, we can help you reach out to the program officer, see if we can get these things figured out, but we'll be looking into it more ourselves, trying to get more training on the things that are specific to your area so that we can be ready for, when is it, January 25th?
Yep.
So yeah, just reach out to us and we'll hold your hand and we'll walk through this together.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of that, Melinda. It might help if you guys maybe in the portal start to put together just a, you know, like this link and some of the other repositories, basically. Maybe you've already done that, but and then as when Dr. Chen makes his version of it and we all want to see it, it can be put there basically. And so
Yeah, that's a good idea.
all right,
Okay.
thanks.
And I would just, for those of you on here who might do human subjects research, if you are worried about IRB implications of any of these plans as you're writing them, feel free to reach out to us if you want answers on anything. We're happy to be flexible and to work with you. And I would also say that the NIH appears to say that basically the IRB telling you can't share things is a justifiable reason for not sharing things. So I guess keep that in mind too.
Well, we are at 4:30. So if anyone has any final question, we can certainly take one more, but I don't want to keep you all late on a Thursday afternoon. Thank you all for joining. Again, I want to reiterate what Melinda said. This is new to everybody, and we're all willing to, I mean, if there's something I don't know and you need an answer to it, we will all dig in and figure this out together. So please reach out and we will help you.